You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. Today, my very special guest is David Daley. David is the author of the national bestseller, Rat Fucked. Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. I love that name, sorry. And Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. His journalism on democracy and voting rights appears regularly in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Slate, The New Republic, and many, many other publications. He's the former editor-in-chief at Salon and has taught journalism and political science as a fellow at Wesleyan University, Boston College, and the University of Georgia. He's a senior fellow at Fairvote and can often be heard on CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. His latest book, Anti-Democratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections, was published last summer in August of 2024 by Mariner Books, and the paperback edition is due out this summer. Folks, if you have any interest at all in the political sphere, in American democracy, or just what's going on in this country right now, the United States, I highly recommend that you pick up one or all of those books. You won't regret it. So, without further ado, David, welcome to the No Delusion Zone.
Thank you for having me, David. I have no delusions left, so this is a good place for me to be.
Well, unfortunately, I deal with a lot of people that do have delusions, and they're running the country right now. So that's kind of why you're here. All right. Well, let me ask you the hardest question first, I think, although there's no easy questions on in this topic. And I've watched a lot of your podcast, your interviews, including one fairly recently, and I got one of the questions out of that. I'll have to admit, but it's very, very relevant, and I know you have an opinion on this, a very strong opinion, David. Right now, this date, where are we at here? January 23rd, 2025. Are we still living in a democracy?
I think we are dangerously close to losing what is left of our democracy. I think we are teetering on the edge of becoming a country that is more like Hungary, which I and others have called a competitive autocracy, in which you still have elections. The elections simply don't make much of a difference, and they don't do anything to affect who actually rules the country. I think what we are looking at right now is a perfect storm of structural problems and structural problems that have been exacerbated by intentional conspiratorial plotting on the right in order to lock themselves into power that is going to be extraordinarily difficult to dislodge them from. I would start, you can start with redistricting. The hammerlock that Republicans have in so many states across the country and state legislatures, based on their ability to draw district lines that are fundamentally unbeatable, that push all of the action into party primaries, and then set up party primaries in which when that's the electorate, a low turnout base electorate, you end up with more extreme people being elected. That's a big part of the problem. A U.S. Senate is a big structural piece of the problem. By 2035, 70% of the country is going to live in 15 states. They'll have 30 senators. The other 70% of the Senate will be made up of 30% of the country. That is a big problem. A U.S. Supreme Court that really has been hijacked by the right over 5 decades, and my new book is about that, and we can get around to talking about that later. But I mean, I think the court in many ways has become sort of a conservative super legislature that has 9 members. They are unelected. They are appointed for life. They are unchecked. They have no ethics code. What they say goes. And what they have done on electoral issues, on the regulatory state, on guns. In many ways, Republicans have been able to win through judicial fiat what they've not been able to win at the ballot box. on so many topics. And John Roberts has been crucial to all of that. And now that you have a Republican trifecta in Washington, you've seen just in the first few days of this administration how they are moving to take um, influence over the media, over technology companies, how quickly those companies are lining up to be on their side, which I think is very, very disturbing. And so it's not quite state media yet, but when the media is owned by billionaires who are lined up on the inaugural dais and contributing seven-figure donations and trying to stay on the right side of a government that's going to be very difficult to dislodge electorally. There are so many complications on so many different areas that our democracy is in a lot of trouble.
Well, there's so many different areas in this that we can unpack, and we would be here for days. Unfortunately,
No.
we don't have the time, and I am going to get to the topics in your books. Um, Back in the 1960s, 1968, actually, in the movie The Graduate, the father-in-law
Plastics.
of the, I was just going to say that he said, remember one word, plastics. And would it be accurate to say right now we should remember one word, which is either redistricting or gerrymandering? Because, at least two of your books, if not all of them, that plays a very central role in everything, in the Voting Rights Act, in voting law, in where we're at right now with the Supreme Court, with elected officials. I mean, that's really the core of where we're at right now, isn't it? Or
I
part of
think
it.
there's I think there's two big pieces that help explain where we're at. And I don't want to be reductive because I think there's many many threads that have come into this. But I think if you want to really unpack two things that are crucial, one is what I wrote about in Ratfucked, which is the Republican strategy called Red Map, which was a play that they ran 2009, 2010, the goal of winning state legislatures around the country ahead of the redistricting that happens every 10 years. We redistrict after the census. So if you can control state legislatures after an election year that ends in zero, you've got a pretty good chance at controlling the redistricting process and drawing yourself friendly lines in all of these states that can assure your victory for the next decade. We've had gerrymandering as long as we've had politicians. This is nothing new. But what was new in 2010, 2011, when these maps were being drawn, was the technology that had come available, just powerful and fast, and all of the data available on all of us. The ability to draw district lines that could create winners and losers for a decade was brand new to our politics. When you combine that with what Republicans were able to do via Red Map, right? They were able to take control of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida,
Battleground states.
Alabama, all of these huge, important states that had previously Democratic control or Democratic chambers under control. And that has not come back in most of those states ever since. And a huge piece of it is redistricting in North Carolina, in Michigan, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. It did not matter whether Democratic candidates won more votes. Republicans always won more seats. And so you could see the influence of redistricting in the US Congress, where in 2012, Democrats win 1.4 million more votes, but Republicans hold a hammerlock on the House even after the nation reelects Barack Obama and adds to the Democratic majority in the US Senate. And you can see it in the state legislatures in these states that enact ever more extreme bills. And then what happens in 2013 is the US Supreme Court delivers the Shelby County versus Holder decision that effectively ends the preclearance provisions in the Voting Rights Act, which were the most important enforcement mechanisms. And that liberated all of these states that now have far right, almost unbeatable state legislatures. It liberated them to go ahead and pass any kind of electoral laws that they wanted to in these
I
states.
was going to
So
ask you about that next, if you could,
yeah,
David. Excuse me, because that's, I think, very important.
yeah, I
Could you?
think it's the combination
Yeah,
of redistricting and a court that has liberated these states to go ahead and do what they want to do.
yeah.
That's just
Get
so
into the,
deeply intertwined.
if you want to talk and just expand a little bit about Shelby County versus Holder and why that's so critical, including talking a little bit more. What is preclearance? Why is that such an important part of all of this? And how did that get us partially to where we are today as far as the redistricting and the slamming the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So when the Voting Rights Act comes into play in 1965, um, it followed what had been many, many years. I mean, decades of Jim Crow, of course, but also many years of trying to fix what was happening in the South via the courts and via legislation. And none of it was particularly effective because local courts or local sheriffs would make end runs around the law or they'd pass new laws. And essentially, what the Voting Rights Act said is we're going to put an end to all of that. The states that have got the worst histories here, and there was a formula to determine it, are going to have to run all of their changes to election law past the Department of Justice or a neutral court in Washington, D.C. before they enact these laws. Effectively, it was putting all these states on probation. We can't trust you, so you're going to have to show us what you're doing before you actually do it. And so in Alabama, in Georgia, in Texas, in parts of North Carolina, parts of Florida, Louisiana, Texas, um, even parts of New York and Alaska were pulled in under these provisions. And this is what put an end to so much of the racist voting procedures across the South. And by 2013, um, even though Congress had reauthorized the Voting Rights Act and preclearance in 2006, almost unanimously, right? It's 98 nothing in the Senate. It's 390 to 30 something, I believe, in the U.S. House. The U.S. Supreme Court decided it knew better. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that things had changed in the South and that these protections were not necessary any longer. Well, when the Republican Congress passed the Voting Rights Act extension in 2006, when it was signed into law by George W. Bush, it came with a 15,000-page report that detailed all of the reasons why it was still very much necessary. All of the small towns across the South where without those protections, it would go back to where it was. Maybe not all the way back to, 1928 and literacy tests or lynchings and violence, but you had, even in the early 2000s, elections being canceled across the South when it looked like a black candidate was about to win. Not in 1950, not in 1962. In 2002, this is still happening in Mississippi. You would see in Louisiana examples of precincts being moved at the last second. And some people being told about it, some people not. I think you can figure out who might have known that the precincts and the election was moving someplace and who might not have. And so this was all still very much necessary. But John Roberts, in his blind wisdom, decides to ignore all of this evidence and to go on his gut that things had changed in the South. Well,
Was this
things had not
naivete,
changed in the
David?
South.
Was it naivete or was it, let's be honest, or was it racism?
Yeah.
You mentioned his upbringing, where he
Right.
came from, and some of the things that have happened subsequent to that may lead one to believe that this was not so much based on his guts telling him that everything was hunky dory now, but in fact, a little bit of not so latent racism. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would say that John Roberts is racist, but I think that I would say that John Roberts is completely unaware of the importance of the Voting Rights Act or what it has meant, and what it continues to mean. I think he grew up in a different world. He's lived in a different world ever since, and the importance of it has simply never touched him.
Not a great
Um,
trait for a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court,
it's a
not
terrible
to have
trait.
this knowledge or capacity to understand that.
That lack of empathy, I think, is a lack of history, lack of current events. I think is horrific in a jurist. Um, uh, but I mean, John Roberts grows up in Indiana. He grows up in one of the most segregated towns in America. He attends in almost entirely all white schools. The town he grows up in is still advertising itself as um, a haven for white Gentiles in long after federal housing protections are passed, anti-discrimination laws. He goes off to Harvard and Harvard Law, and then he is clerking for Justice Rehnquist at the court. Justice Rehnquist, of course, back in the 1950s and 60s, is personally involved in efforts to keep Latino voters in Arizona from the polls. It was Bill Rehnquist waving around constitutions and demanding that Latino voters read them and define words. Um, uh, and this is where John Roberts trains. John Roberts, as a young aide in the Reagan White House, is working on putting an end to the Voting Rights Act in 1982. This is Roberts's life's work in many ways, even though he doesn't, I think, fully understand. I think he's got a theoretical sense of color blindness in his head, that um, the only thing he's ever heard, Martin Luther King say, right, is the famous speech about the content of his character and not the color of his skin. And when that's the only king sometimes it leads you. That provides justification, I think, for trying to believe that things are over and past that are still very much alive
Well,
in the
you may
present.
be right, David, because from what from what I've read of what your writings, from what I've seen of the Roberts Court, he very well may be that naive and but also lacking in compassion. But I mean, for example, the horrendous SCOTUS decision last year giving any U.S. president qualified immunity to do almost anything, knowing that Donald Trump is friends with racists, with white supremacists, with neo Nazis. He knew that. They knew that. To give him qualified immunity, or which is basically total immunity, when in fact he is going to side with white supremacists, Christian nationalists. Um, I don't know. It stretches credulity sometimes to say that he is not aware of these factors, but he may be. And if that's the case, then he's being led by the others in the court to make these horrific decisions. I'm not sure.
I think he is aware. You can't not be aware of the consequences of these decisions. I mean, Shelby County comes down, and an hour later, Texas announces its draconian bill that prevent a voter ID bill that prevents 600,000 Latinos from voting, citizens, but citizens who lacked the specific forms of ID that the state intentionally required, knowing that they didn't have them. Um, because and this is what happens across the South in the days and months after Shelby County. You see these targeted surgical voter ID and voter suppression bills designed to take out the days, they limit early voting on the days in which blacks are most likely to do it. They require forms of voter ID, but eliminate the forms of ID that uh, racial minorities or young people are most likely to have. You close precincts, and you do so disproportionately uh, in neighborhoods where blacks and Latinos are most likely to live. Um, So even if John Roberts believes in June of 2013 that things have changed in the South, by September of 2013, it should be pretty clear that nothing has changed. But John Roberts does not change his opinion on this. John Roberts doubles down, and this court continues, and it continues to this day to deliver decision after decision that makes it easier for this kind of voter suppression and nonsense to continue. And it's why Roberts is the most important Republican politician of the last couple of decades. Roberts comes on the scene saying, "Oh, I'm just a humble judge from Indiana. I see cornfields in my sleep, and all I do is I call balls and strikes. I'm just an umpire, kids. I'm just playing baseball here. I'm reffing the game." Well, what Roberts has done is change the game. I mean, Roberts is an umpire the same way Leslie Nielsen is an umpire in The Naked Gun, right? As soon as the pitch is thrown, he goes into his call. And Roberts is an umpire depending on who is on the mound, and what team is at bat. And his strike zone is completely different. And what he has done is deliver victory after victory that has aided his side and delivered things that would never otherwise have been winnable, whether this is gutting voting rights, whether this is the regulatory state, whether it's guns, whether it's abortion, or whether it's the ruling you're talking about that essentially makes Donald Trump a king. Decision after decision that would have never been winnable, that that Americans of all parties disagree with and find innately anti-democratic and distasteful. Roberts has enabled and made possible.
Could you talk about something I think is important in talking again about the U.S. Supreme Court, which I think has changed the entire character of it, and that's the major questions doctrine. This Supreme Court operates from that and decides a lot of cases based on that. What was it like before that that was the MO, and how has it changed it in any way?
Yeah, I think that and I'm a journalist and not a lawyer. But really what the major questions doctrine has done is it has provided the conservative supermajority with the justification to take on essentially any question that it deems to be a major question. So if it thinks that there are high stakes in an issue, it can simply say, well, we believe that we ought to take this on. One might suggest that Congress and the elected branches of government ought to be the ones that are taking on these major questions, not an unelected super majority of 9. But when your goal is to run the nation through that unelected supermajority of 9, the major questions doctrine is a very convenient and easy way to pluck cases that would otherwise perhaps have been outside of the court's jurisdiction and claim them for their own and allow themselves to weigh in and become the final arbiters.
Well, that doctrine, the major questions doctrine, along with the redistricting and the gerrymandering, I think has gone an enormous way to allowing the Republicans to take over, even though they don't usually get the most votes. It's just staggering to me. And of course, one of my pet peeves, and I don't know how you feel about this exactly, is that I'm very, very disgusted with the American electorate. I'm not a journalist by trade, but the media tends to give the American public a pass. And they blame everything on a number of people. They blame it on the Republicans. They blame it on the Democrats. It's never the voters, though. The American publics are held blameless. They just, Anyway, I think that's nonsense. I think that and I'll just say it. That's why this is the no delusion zone. The American public right now is in an incredible situation where there's just a pandemic of stupidity that's going around. They don't read anything. And I don't even mean conservatives, anybody. They don't read. It's the sound bites generation. And that's not new, but they really, really have turned away from everything and they don't care. They're also very oblivious. They don't read and they're oblivious. And so that's why we're here. We've got a Supreme Court that's an unelected body that's making the laws that, just as you said, appointed a king. We're allowing the Republicans to redistrict and gerrymander their way to their heart's delight. And I do want to touch upon that now in a minute. At the state level, I don't even mean the federal state level, the local state level, where they're controlling state legislatures. And nobody cares. Nobody thinks about that. Well, they have now successfully committed or exercised a coup at the state level, which has resulted in the successful gerrymandering, which has resulted in Republicans winning elections now, even without the majority vote. I know it's a long-winded way of saying that I'm very disgusted with the American electorate. And until they learn civics, until they start to read, which probably won't happen in either of our lifetimes, I don't see any way out of this. Let me segue then into what you've written a lot about, which is the successful Republican mission to take over state legislatures at the state level, thereby allowing them to do the things they've done for these 50 years that you talked about in your books. Could you talk a little bit about the plan? It's a grassroots plan that took shape starting 50 years ago that the Democrats were total failures, oblivious, didn't know about, or if they did, they didn't care.
Yeah,
And in 5 minutes or less. Just kidding.
I have to deliver a soundbite too. See, this is why we're all getting dumber.
Yes. No, please take your time. I'm serious.
No,
This
please.
is a crucial point.
I think you're right. No, and I think we're in this dangerous place for a lot of reasons. And the American electorate owns its share of it. At the same time, the American electorate has had a lot of its options taken away from it. This supermajority on the Supreme Court was appointed by presidents that did not win the popular vote. It was ratified by a U.S. Senate that only a couple times in the last 30 years has actually represented a majority of Americans or had a majority support from Americans. And the redistricting of the nation has made it possible for Republicans and ever more extreme Republicans to win power and hold power and retain power, even when they have fewer votes.
Explain that, David, because most of my viewers aren't going to be aware of what redistricting means at the state level.
Yeah.
For when they do it successfully, they control the votes. They control the voting map.
We redistrict every congressional district and every state legislative district every 10 years after the census. The idea of this is for fairness. The idea of this is to keep districts of the same size and population. The reality of it is that it becomes a very unfair, manipulative process, because if you've got the power to draw the district lines and decide where the Republicans and Democrats go, you have the power to control a winners and losers of elections for the next 10 years. There are two main ways of gerrymandering. There's cracking and there's packing. So essentially, what you do if you have control of the process is you draw as many districts as possible where you pack the other side in. So you create, if you're a Republican drawing these districts, you might create a handful of seats that Democrats win overwhelmingly, 85, 90% of the vote. And then there are fewer Democrats in all of the other districts. So then you draw yourself a bunch of districts, you win 57, 58%, you scatter your own votes more effectively, and you pack the other side in. And so you could have an electorate, and we've seen this in Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio and North Carolina. You could see an electorate that gives more votes statewide to Democratic candidates, But Republicans sometimes have drawn the maps so skillfully that even when Democrats win more statewide votes, Republicans can still hold super majorities or near super majorities in some of these states. Because the power to draw these lines is so important and so determinative, and because our voting is so easy to predict based on our past votes, on the magazines we subscribe to, on the websites we look at, all of which they know and have packed into these map making programs and the software that draws these district lines. So when you have that control, you can essentially nullify elections for the next decade. You still have the elections, but they just don't mean anything. And I would suggest that elections that don't mean anything aren't really elections at all and don't really speak to consent of the governed at all. And that was the purpose of the Republican red map strategy back in 2010. It was to win control of state legislatures so that they could lock in control over the redistricting process. And so Republicans won in 2010, and then they ensured that they would win in 2012, 14, 16, 18, and 20 in all of those states as well. And fundamentally, they did. And even when voters tried to throw them out, they could not. And when a majority of us in a state or in a nation cannot overthrow or kick our leaders out of office, that is fundamentally not a democracy.
Right now, David, and as far as you know, about how many states do the Republicans control at the state level, at the legislative level, including probably the governor?
Yeah, it's Republican trifectas. We've hit a point in which it's almost entirely Republican and Democratic trifectas in the country. Republicans, I believe, have got probably up around 30 or so of these. The important thing, though, is that they took control of these trifectas in so many states where it was 50-50. So it's not just that Republicans in 2010 took control of red states. It's that they took control of purple Wisconsin and purple North Carolina and purple Michigan and purple Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can control the purple states as well as the red states, and when there's really no hope of Democrats winning in these other states, it becomes really difficult. And then what you see, in North Carolina right now, right? You have a very close election for the state Supreme Court. And it's only the state Supreme Court in North Carolina that can do anything to overturn the map. So Republicans are fighting very hard to keep control of the state Supreme Court. And they are essentially trying to overturn an election in which a Democratic justice won a statewide seat by about 750 votes. In Florida, the only way for voters to have any say in a state that's been so wildly gerrymandered unconstitutionally is through the ballot measure, through the initiative process. And Ron DeSantis came out just today and said they're going to try to make it all the more difficult in a state where it's already pretty difficult for citizens to wage a ballot initiative. You have to get 60% of the vote in Florida. And even when voters have been successful in doing that, it's not always recognized or enacted into law by the legislature and the courts there. But they're trying to make it that much more difficult. So really what you see here is that gerrymandered legislatures once in power continue to find ways to entrench themselves in power and to limit the ability of citizens to do anything to get them out of office. And we are watching that right now, not in Hungary, not in Russia, but in North Carolina. It's what we've been watching in Wisconsin for the last 20 years. If this was happening in any other country, we would think it was absolute autocracy. It's happening here right now. And we need to be aware of it because it's coming to your state next.
David, this seems to me, anyway, to go right back to 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. This seems all on the Republican side to be a reaction to that. It's taken 50 years to really, make it solid to do what they wanted to do. It's taken half a century, but it all started back then. You mentioned in your books 1971. Some things started going on there. 1982 with the Roberts Court, and on and on and on. 2013, but it started in 1965. So correct me if I'm wrong. This seems all to be a reaction to the Voting Rights Act, and it all comes back to racism.
Yeah, I do think that this is a response to fear of a multiracial society.
I think it's hard to look at it any other way. I mean, not you, but someone can, and certainly the Republicans do. And every MAGA person I talk to denies they're a racist, but they vote for racists and neo-Nazis and white supremacists, but they're not racist.
Right.
Okay. I think this is all about racism, and I'll believe that till my last breath.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think that to me, the real question in this country, ever since our founding, has been whether a multiracial nation can find its way to become a multiracial democracy. And the Voting Rights Act is the very best articulation. I would say that the Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Voting Rights Act are what put us on the road to actually being a multiracial democracy. And that the continued work to chip away at those amendments, at the Voting Rights Act, is itself work to erode the idea of multiracial democracy. And that's what we are looking at.
Just wrote a piece today in reaction to somebody who still says, good meaning people, well-meaning people, that we have to change all of this, meaning the Republicans winning the election and all of the executive orders that have been written, because this is not who we are. And I had a reaction to that, one I've written about for many, many years. No, actually, it is who we are. If it wasn't who we are, we wouldn't be where we are today. It's at least 30 to 40% of who we are. And it's almost 50% of those who can drag their asses to the voting polling places or send it in the mail to vote. So, yeah, it really is who we are. And when I see someone like an Elon Musk give the Nazi salute, and that was a Nazi salute, I don't care what anybody says, but worse, to have the people in the audience applauding, I feel that we're doomed. I mean, we're doomed in the short run, because until those people, I don't know how to say it, don't exist anymore, at least they're not in power, we're not going to continue as a democracy if we already haven't been a failed democracy now. You can't have somebody giving the Nazi salute not once but twice, standing at the presidential podium in the Capitol of the United States of America, and then having the audience applaud. That's insane. I will never accept it, but that's where we are. So I just want to get that out. David, that is who we are today. I'm sorry. What are your thoughts about that?
No, I mean, it's hard to argue. We are who the election results say we are. And in this last election, Trump did win the popular vote. He did win all of those swing states. I mean, it is hard to say at this point that we don't know who he is or what he believes. He has been the dominant player on the political scene for the last decade. We know who he is. We know what he's about. We know what he has done. Um, a majority of us voted for
And I
it.
hate when people, again, well-meaning people say, well, some of them are well-meaning. You can't listen to him. He doesn't mean half of what he says. He's a real kidder. No, you can't really take him seriously. Bullshit. Of course he's serious. That's where we failed, or at least a lot of us did, by not taking him seriously. That's so naive and it's so stupid. And again, it's why we're here today. I can't leave, at least my audience, with not a shred of something positive to think about. So I'll ask you the last question. And I know you've been asked this in almost every interview. What could Americans do? Not the MAGA Americans, don't care about them, to be honest, but what can the rest of us do in America to try to not fight back physically, but to fight back politically, to try to at least keep what is left of our democracy and to claw it back? So in future elections, we may actually get it back again. What can the average American do?
I think we need to fight for electoral reform that makes every vote matter again. We need to fight for elections that actually can be won by majorities of voters. So that means in states where you can fight for an independent redistricting commission, like voters did in Michigan, they ought to stand up and do that. I think if that means what voters in Maine and Alaska have done, which is embrace ranked choice voting, so that you can ensure that when you've got multiple candidates on the ballot, that the winner is not some MAGA winner with 34% of the vote and everybody else splits up the rest of it. But that you actually get a majority winner. I mean, Alaska right now experimenting with the combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting. So what you end up with there, instead of two primaries, Republican and Democratic, and no one for the independents, which would probably be the largest party in many states, if not in the entire country. But when you have primaries like that, right, you might have 14 candidates and someone wins the primary with 32% of the vote. And then you get two people who can't even win majorities supporting their own parties standing in the general election, and you end up with one extremist or another. If you have a big open primary, everybody runs, the 4 or 5 top candidates move on to the general election, and you use ranked choice voting so that you get a majority winner. The incentives are different suddenly. Suddenly you're when you can't win with your base and when you have to talk to everybody, that makes a huge, huge difference, not only in how you run, but in how you govern. I think that the incentives in our politics are so backwards right now because our elections incentivize the absolute worst behavior. And so if we can start by fixing the incentives in our elections, perhaps we will get different kind of candidates, or at least different kinds of winners who then behave differently once they're elected. But until we fix our elections, until we fix districts, we are going to be stuck in this place. We've got to address the fundamental root causes of all of this if we ever want to see any change.
And I think what you're saying, and again, you've written about this, you've spoken about this, is we, meaning again, everybody except MAGA, need to take back the grassroots part of our country. We need to operate at the grassroots. We need to fight and win at the local level first. Not worry about the president right now. Let's get on the school boards. Let's get on
Yes.
all the local sanitation boards, all the local parks and recreation and highways and things that really do matter to every American every day. Let's get back to that. And if we can
Democracy,
successfully,
yeah.
that's where democracy comes from
Democracy is a
elections up.
verb. It's not a
Yeah,
noun. It's a
yeah.
verb, and we have to live it and we have to act it. And you're right. We have to be on all of those boards. We have to be involved. We have to get out there and do the work because it doesn't protect itself.
Well,
And
I
so
think
here we
a
are.
two-pronged effort, winning at the local level and getting back to civics education. If we can do those two things over the next several years, I think we have a chance.
Good start. Good start. Let's go.
Let's
get
leave
to
it
work.
there, David. I agree with you. Listen, thank you so much. David, you've been fantastic. David Daley, he's written many, many books. Bestseller is one of my favorite names is Rat Fucked. I don't know if I'm going to get kicked out of YouTube for that, but his most recent book, though, however, came out last summer, and that is called The Anti-Democratic Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. The hardcover is out right now by Mariner Books. He's showing it to you. I'm actually going to put up a copy of this later on at the end of the podcast. And the paperback edition comes out this summer. Again, I highly recommend you folks take a look at it, pick it up, and you'll definitely learn something. David Daley, thank you so much. Let's do this again. You take care, stay safe, and try to stay sane.
Thank you, David. You too.